I'm going to really bring economic history here. I think history will offer some useful insight. The global economic order is in a state of flux. And as I think about this question, I think about the danger and risk of oversimplification when interpreting history. It appears to me that we are going through a gradual decimation of the old socio-political economic order, with a caveat, an important caveat, that this is still evolving. You know, a new order is yet to be born. Branko Milanovic, in his 2016 book, his book in 2016, explains the dynamics of globalization and inequality by attributing the periodic rises and falls in inequalities to war and disease, education, technology, and redistribution, with the conclusion that inequality will not grow in perpetuity. Milanovic also laments the relative impotence of the two traditional tools for reducing inequality, that is taxation and transfers. And his argument is that they seem to have reached their limit. So as an alternative, he wants to see the distribution of endowments by reducing disparities, in both capital endowments and human capital. And he also, talked about other policies like a more open migration policies and what have you. But my point here is, what is the role of a crisis in social, economic, and political transformation? You would notice that new economic agents, new technologies, new business models often emerge on the heels of major global crises. And I'm going to start here at home, New York City. Let's bring New York City to this conversation. As you know, this is the global capital of reinvention. Right from its founding as New Amsterdam, through the various demographic, political, cultural, and industrial shocks, that have shaped the emergence of New York as a global leader in finance and innovation, you find that its industrial core, its industrial fabric, has always enabled it to transform structurally. And this is obvious when you consider how the city has been able to reinvent itself to address major shocks in the global economy. So from its beginning as a trading outpost to how it evolved to become a commercial and maritime power, and later, transforming to an industrial and manufacturing hub, before then becoming the global capital of finance and innovation, real estate, and media. So in the aftermath of the fiscal crisis of the 1970s, and then the 9/11 terrorist attacks, the global financial crisis of 2007 and 2008, Superstorm Sandy, what you find in all of this is that the city persevered, and bounced back stronger. That's from a city perspective. And then you extrapolate that. Let's look at the global arena. You have seen that a series of wars of conquest, colonialism and imperialism, have always led to the emergence of a new strand of global capitalism. And we can trace this to Europe. Let's look at Europe, during the age of discovery, from the 15th century to the 18th century, when European overseas exploration led to the bloody conquest, of the Americas, starting in 1492, the transatlantic economy, colonial and interstate systems, and deepened East-West trade. And then we saw the Industrial Revolution, in Britain, the ascendancy to power of the bourgeoisie. And then the American Revolution and the French Revolution of 1776 and 1789, respectively. Then came the latter part of the 19th century, marked by the rise of country-level corporate capitalism, which again heralded a new wave of imperialist conquest, which manifested through the consolidation of industrial and financial corporations, nation states, and national markets under one global system. This ultimately led to the oil and fiscal crisis of the 1970s and the rapid inflation that we saw in that era, which eroded the purchasing power of our savings and the ultimate decimation of the gold window, Keynesian economics, and the unified fixed exchange system. And then that led to the collapse of the Bretton Woods system and the global financial system. I think that was an inflection point. That was a key moment in history. Capitalism pretty much went global at that point, with the full integration of the global economic system. And that then heralded the rise of multinational capital and multinational or transnational states. And what have we seen in the past few decades? We have seen a gradual erosion, again, in labor's share of total output in favor of capital, due to the prevailing capital-intensive multinational system of production, which started, in the era I just talked about. In addition to the concentration of capital ownership, this mode of wealth creation, continues to generate varying returns to different categories of labor. And what you often find is that workers at the top end of the income distribution would benefit, more disproportionately over time. It's also important to mention that the share of labor in total output is not falling within a typical firm. Instead, what you find is that it is a gradual reallocation. It's a steady reallocation across firms. So from labor-intensive firms, which are very small, often, to big capital-intensive superstar firms. And you can make sense of that when you think about the Amazons, the Facebooks, the Googles of this world. In the immediate aftermath of the pandemic, Harvard University's Opportunity Insight, which is a special research project, that tracks data and other distributional implications. Their research found that a few months after the pandemic, while jobs were fully back to pre-pandemic levels for the highest wage earners, it was a different ballgame for those at the lower end of the spectrum. They found that more than 50%, that's more than half of those earning below $20 per hour still did not have their jobs back. Look at that. I mean, that's clearly not acceptable. So the challenge that we face today, in some way, is similar to what was faced by FDR, when he introduced the New Deal, in 1933, after the crisis of that era. And in today's terms, you would even think that that was radical. I mean, you think about many of the components of the 1933 deal, from government-backed deposit insurance for the banking systems to large public work programs, massive regulation, of Wall Street, minimum wage legislation, social security reform, trade policy reform, housing reform, etc. The challenges of this era in some ways, show that maybe this is another point of inflection. I think we are again back at an inflection point. And that does require some moment, to really recalibrate and look at the implications of the policies and initiatives, that will drive the new economy. Today, we are talking about a global pandemic, the rise of nationalism, protectionism, and deglobalization. So, in my view, I think that global capitalism is under serious danger again. But this time, not from the usual suspect. The issue today is not about inflationary pressures, but it's under threat from things like externalities, market failures, all of this triggered by the inadequate attention given to social, political, and environmental issues. So in order to avert a major catastrophe, in order to avoid a total breakdown of the political and economic system, existing models and frameworks are not adequate. And economic science, economic engineering, and other complementary disciplines, psychology, philosophy, political science, engineering, finance, all of these disciplines have come to agree on, what are the best practices and how do we rethink the next economy and the new economy. I will leave that there.